This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Noliwe Rooks, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University, where she is also founding director of the Sagronomics Lab. Her work is widely engaged with African American women's history, education, and cultural studies, and she is the author of a number of books, including most recently A Passionate Mind and Relentless Pursuit, The Vision of Mary McLeod Bethune from 2024, and Integrated, How American Schools Failed Black Children from 2025. In this discussion, we explore the relation of intellectual work to political struggle, the history and intellectual tradition of the field, and how the future of Black studies is shaped and reshaped by contemporary concerns. Noliwe, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, John?
It is the day after inauguration when we're recording this, so all caveats in place. Great.
But what's kind of nice about it right now is we know that they're executive orders, but we're not watching the military march through the streets in search of undocumented folks. And it sort of feels like we hear bad things are going to happen, but we're in this little moment where we're not witnessing them. It's a little moment there.
It says something about the rise of a far-right government, that these would be our comfort.
It's our comfort. It's our comfort. We did maybe see a Nazi salute. Maybe there is some dispute about that, but no one has been attacked by Nazis in the streets. So,
well, all I know is, 4 years ago, I lived right on one of the major streets that goes into DC, and all we heard were sirens, and we heard no sirens yesterday. So that's the difference of 4 years makes. But here we are. First of all, I'm really happy that you made the time. I've been reading your work for a long time, really appreciate it. It's super interesting stuff. And I know you've been working in the field of Black studies for a good while. And so getting your thoughts in this series is a real treat for us. So thank you for making the time.
I've been actually listened to it. You are a must-listen podcast destination for me. It's so great the range of perspectives, generations, and ideas that you gather. Really, bravo, sir.
Oh, thank you. I'll pass that on to Ashley. We appreciate that.
Please.
It's a labor of love, but we also really want it to be a serious contribution to our shared field. So I appreciate that. And as we were talking about beforehand, as a former advisor to your kid at Amherst College, it's nice to have
hey,
to connect this way. Exactly. I hope he listens to this and knows can give him a quick quiz on Black existentialism after all these years.
Mm-hmm.
So let me start. We'll talk about your work, about its relationship to the field of Black studies and your imagination of the field and these sorts of things. But I wanted to start really with a first question that's maybe a little bit more personal, or about your own journey as a writer and thinker. What drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And what sustains you in relation to both of those?
Well, thank you. Let's just get started with the really easy question. Like, why? Why did you even
why do we do this?
Find yourself here? I think that I listened to one of your podcasts recently with Cy Grundy, and I was resonating with some of their insights about their background, how they were raised, and the ways that impacted how she saw her career and her life and what she was drawn to. So I think in a similar way, there are two things that drew me to Black studies. Really, one had to do with the fact that I was a voracious reader. At a young age, my grandmother was a reading teacher in the segregated South, and so she taught me to read at a fairly early age, and I'm an only child. And so I spent a lot of time by myself, but I'm also a talkative child. So adults liked it when I had something to occupy my time. So I read all the time, and I was in a community of people who were heavily involved. My mother, one group of them were heavily involved with the Panthers and with activism in the San Francisco Bay Area and with the founding of Black Studies, actually. My mother and Danny Glover were part of a group of folks who took over a newspaper office along with Jimmy Garrett and some other folks. And that really kind of kicked off the strike that then led to. It was one of the precipitating events of the months-long strike, one of the demands of which to resolve it was the creation of first a college of ethnic studies, but it was settled, negotiated down to a department of Black Studies. So that's one side of the people I was around in the San Francisco Bay Area, who I grew up around, what they talked about, what they were thinking about. As I said, some were Panthers, so that was a whole other part of the conversation. At the same time, the other folks were diasporic thinkers. There were people from as part of the community, the Caribbean, Africa, South America, who were talking about Black freedom struggles in global context. In that context, what really drew them together was their work around the 6th Pan-African Congress, the Free Africa movement, Free South Africa movement, the divestment campaigns. The conversation there had everything to do with imperialism, militarism, with the ills, these big isms and ills that globally were oppressing Black folks, and who the thinkers were, and the movements and the moments that that Black people needed to know about if they were going to prepare themselves to join or to have to begin their own movement. And so I was a kid that was just sitting around tables on the weekend where people debated vociferously the smallest points, like, are you a Trotskyite? What kind of Marxist are you? You don't just get to be a Marxist. What is the commitments to your Marxism? With freedom fighters from Angola, I knowing who the folks were in what was then called the Third World when I was growing up, and called the Global South these days, but what was the Third World, knowing who those freedom fighters were, who Amilcar Cabral was, who Patrice Lumumba was, who Walter Rodney was. I mean, you had to know not just the names, but what they did in their context. So this is how I grew up. This is how I thought people understood the world, through books that attracted them. And I will say the books would be everything from Fidel's History Will Absolve Me. I said something backward, or what my family considered backward one time about Che and Fidel. I remember what it was. Next thing I know, I had reading lists, right, on Cuba. here are things, and the next time
these are parents I can relate to.
Yes, right. I mean, you have to now incorporate this in what you're thinking and explain it to us. But I didn't know any different, right? Like, this is what you did. I was reading a lot of James Baldwin. I had an English teacher aunt, who was giving me a lot of Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, and I was consuming all of that. So between the activism and just the brilliance of artists, my entree really was how artists engaged the intellectual aspects of Black freedom, what they saw. There was really nothing else for me to do but be an academic in a way, right? Like, I thought I liked reading, I liked talking, but more importantly, I thought there was a utility to it, because again, the way I learned to read and talk was with people who said, in different contexts, not necessarily coming out of Black studies, that you have to, your intellect needs to be in the service of something. And your community, some aspects of your community have to be organized around Black freedom. These are not things that I am saying that people or everyone should have. That everyone should think like this. This is the way to be. This is how I was raised. And this is how I was raised, so that those lessons came through in a like as a just a pattern everywhere, every conversation, almost every party, and then of course we were around people who were getting killed, like people we knew were being murdered for various reasons, because again it was a global Black freedom struggle, and murder was a part of it. And so understanding that Black life and the protection of Black life, and the ability for the thinking about Black people and the structures and ideologies that oppressed Black people, that there was a lifelong project that was called freedom, that was bound up with all of those activities: the listening, the thinking, the reading, and the writing. And at the time that I was in grad school, and I actually started grad school as an English major, because again, big reader. And I was really thinking about, so what am I going to do? I didn't know anything else other than you build something, you build institutionally. So where am I going to build institutionally with English in ways that reach Black people globally and are about Black freedom, right? I mean, it's just not the English part of my world for me was really just completely because it was a pleasurable place for me to be. Mm-hmm. It was not a place that I could see how do you order your steps to build something structural, institutional, long lasting. And so I ended up sort of, and I didn't want to read any more Shakespeare. I could sound all kind of high-minded if I want to, but I did the Gawain and the Green Knight. No, the Great Vowel Shift, didn't want to do it. And in English at the University of Iowa at the time, I was going back through. Folks who I didn't think I was going to survive that whole, doing that again, doing Chaucer again, proving that I had an analysis of Chaucer that would rock your world. Didn't want to do it.
As I tell my students when they look at grad disciplines or area studies to go into, I always remind them, you got to teach what you study. So.
Yes, you have to read it over.
No?
I would tell that is the best advice. I really was like, I don't think Shakespeare I could have rocked with. Right, there's enough aspects to him that's whatever. But there's some other folks that English doctoral preparation, which at the time you had to be back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. You couldn't just be like, I'm only going to do the 20th century. Yeah, no. So at the time at the University of Iowa, there was a professor named Darwin Turner, who was one of the early, a little bit unsung, I think, early Black intellectuals, sort of in the era of Sterling Brown. Those folks who come out of literary studies very, very early, so that by the 60s and 70s, they're already ensconced in these institutions, teaching about Black people. And Darwin Turner was one of these folks, very grand, very formal. And he was the head of Black Studies there. Now, again, I've told you, I got to Black Studies through people who were not unfamiliar with armed struggle, people who had in various places taken up arms, if they were Panthers, if they were in at the time it was called Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe. People took up arms. And so this is a different kind of way to be a Black intellectual. What Darwin Turner modeled for me was a very different politic, what some might have called a politic of respectability, an old school politic of respectability. He's always had on a suit, always very exact, high standards, but very much a traditionalist. And so I went running off to Black Studies thinking, again, trained by revolutionaries, that this is what was going to happen. And it was a little confusing when you get to this, dude who is like, great, he's lovely, but he is hardly anybody's revolutionary in the sense, in the very narrow sense that I understood what that looked like. He wasn't wearing black jackets and berets. I mean, come on. But he saw this history of Black writing and Black letters as a beachhead, as a way to enter for Black people in the universe of Black people, the scholarly and intellectual and artistic universes of Black people, to enter the academy. And he saw that was the goal. That was it. Mm-hmm. And so I came to it thinking Black studies was going to be one thing, and honestly running away from English. And I actually was in an American studies department at the time. You had to be in American studies to get to Black studies. There was no freestanding way to get a degree that didn't go through this department. So I entered that, and then I came upon this very genteel way of talking about some really radical literature. Robert Hayden, I mean, I'll go back to nerd, the stuff no one teaches anymore, the stuff that people don't read, the stuff my grad students probably don't know, some of those. If I say Sterling Brown, they're going to look blankly. Or Robert Hayden, or I mean, these things in their moment.
Breaking my heart here. This is terrible.
I don't think they would. I don't know. I know we don't teach it, let me say, but I don't remember the last time I had a conversation with a grad student who knew this generation of writers beyond Langston Hughes. I mean, they're sort of old folks. It is Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, Du Bois, of course. That might be about it. That you can count on, that you can probably be sure of. You start talking about these people who today, folks are going to tell you they're kind of obscure, right? Who's reading Renegade, right? Who reads that? But for me, I could see the beauty and I could see form as a weapon. That's probably the best way to say it. What that older generation of people allowed me to see was how formalism, how a form could become a weapon in a larger kind of way. And that was new. That was new for me. So I think the short answer, now that I've been talking for about 15 minutes, is what led me to Black Studies is it encompassed all of it scratched my intellectual and my activist and my organizational and my institutional itches. It scratched them all. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't find another place that felt like I was contributing to something larger, again, as I understood it. As a young person, as I understood the work of the academy, for me, Black Studies came out of struggle, right? And again, the people who I knew paid a price for being in and around Black Studies. People were getting fired. It was a radical space that the administrations, again, I'm in San Francisco, I'm out in California, that the administration is willing to call out the military to put down. So when I think of Black Studies, again, it's very idiosyncratic on my part. It's all of those things. And I didn't see how form and tradition could play quite so big a role as what I learned with Darwin Turner at the University of Iowa, an earlier generation of U.S. thinkers and artists, the way that they understood it. So between all of that there was more to learn, that there were just books to read, that there were thoughts to think, all of the things I was most interested in, Black Studies offered me.
I love that. In some ways, the follow-up question is maybe, your response will be just listen back to what I just said, because I'm interested in how because what you spoke to, and being in the Bay Area really sharpens your narrative there in terms of the founding of Black Studies. I mean, I am drawn in listening to you by this two sides. I don't want to say like dueling sort of approaches, but these two sides of Black Studies, which is this interest in books and intellectual tradition and the life of ideas and conversation, which was part of the founding of Black Studies, which was that element of Black life was not on campuses. Black Studies was going to be where you locate this kind of work, right, to produce and reproduce interventions and appreciations and extensions of the tradition. But also, as you were pointing out, it's a moment of a shift in liberation struggle. Right, that it really collapsed so many of those ideas about distinctions between campus and community, between reading, thinking, and action and militancy. So, Black Studies has that tension at its founding. And so I'm curious, to maybe hear you talk a little bit more, or maybe as I just suggested, say, listen to back what I just said, but how you imagine Black Studies in 2025. I mean, we're 56 years after the founding.
Yeah,
with this tension, how do you imagine the field in relation to that moment?
So here's my personal struggles. I have had to come to understand that because one of my third book, but 20 years ago, I wrote a book about the founding of Black Studies. That was really, it's very much because I was working in at Princeton in a Black Studies department. And I was looking around at it was my first time being on Ivy League campus, first time really being hardcore on the East Coast. I went to Sarah Lawrence for a year as an undergrad. Took some time off. That was too much of a transition for me. And then went to Spelman. But I hadn't been around Ivy League. I mean, UC Berkeley or Stanford were like the fancy campuses where I was growing up, right? And I came in contact with a whole other strata of Black people that I just wasn't familiar with. They had been like living and working together and knew each other just fine. But those folks who came out of Ivy League institutions and with those that wanted PhDs, tended to then work at Ivy League institutions. And the institutions attracted different kinds of Black people than those that I was used to, in the stripped down kind of way. It attracted a whole bunch of Black people that you would speak to on campus and they would not speak back. Like, this was a big thing. People were constantly like, you give the head nod to these Black people and they look the other way. They try to avoid you. They do not want any kind of unity. And that's probably going far. I don't mean to, I'm not trying to disparage, but I was very used to by then having, I went to undergrad at Spelman, just rude. You speak to people. If people speak to you, you just speak back. That's just like at the level of
that is not
home
acceptable
training.
in the South.
Yes, it's just level of just basic home training, how you behave in public. If people make eye contact and speak, you speak back. So there was one thing and I was like, you're just rude. But again, I was in the South for that. But also that there are Black people now, lots of Black people who, for a variety of reasons, if they're not African American, like their ethnicity is located in another nation, if they think that we're beyond it, I mean, there's a plethora of reasons why it's the case, but they don't see themselves as in solidarity with Black people. The Black skin is not the thing that's signaling solidarity for them. Even passing solidarity. Nobody's talking about like solidarity. We're getting in there and doing something. Just passing, like we recognize ourselves as here. Let me acknowledge you as being another Black person. Ivy League's first time I'd ever been around Black people who went out of their way to make clear that they wanted nothing to do with you. And that started kind of changing my conception. The other thing about Black studies, for me, again, pre-Ivy League, was Black students actually wanted it. I mean, one of the narratives about how it's founded is because Black students across the country, white students too, but the center of the ask are Black students, are demanding it. Sometimes at the point of guns, or one at Cornell, where I used to teach, at least on the one time. Cornell. I don't want to say many times, but at least that one time, there's the Pulitzer Prize winning photograph of them walking out armed. With machine guns, etc. So this idea that Black people and Black studies would enter campuses and not be something that was wanted or was worthy of protection or was even really worthy of defining what it was supposed to be. What that was new. When I that was new. That was new for me. And so there, watching how Black Studies became an argument about what you need to take with you into your journey to the elite classes about Black people that's useful to you. It was much more idiosyncratic. Again, this is just according to me. I can defend everything I'm saying, but I am not trying to say this is everybody's experience. Right. I'm not making a grand argument about what is true for everyone. But the pieces that led me to understand what Black Studies is now definitely go through that kind of alienating experience from Black people that took place on Ivy League campuses while I was working in a Black Studies department. And I'm not unique. I mean, I've talked to other people. They recognize the same kind of thing. So at this moment, I think that Black Studies is a lot. Black Studies is whatever anybody wants it to be at any moment, wherever they happen to be. There's no center to it other than Blackness. I frustrate some of the junior scholars sometimes when I say, so what's your understanding of a Black Studies methodology? You know, we're trying to hire them. You're asking questions over meals. Nobody trying to embarrass people in public, but just sort of as you locate yourself in the field of Black Studies, how do you understand it? Like, narrate for me what you see the field as. And increasingly, I get pushback from junior scholars who are sort of like, it's just whatever we want it to be as long as it's about Black people. And for a minute, for some years, I would really be trying to push back on that, be like, no, there's a body of literature. People expect you to have some sense. Right? People expect you, if you say Chinua Achebe, you got some sense of who in the heck we're talking about. Yeah. If you say Richard Wright, that you've read something, you don't just know. I don't remember last time I talked to somebody who had actually read any Richard Wright, really, actually. So it meant something different to me. And I've had to come to grips with the fact that it just simply doesn't mean that anymore. Like that it is where young people, older people, it's where you go if there's something that you can't do in your traditional discipline. That's a big reason that people find Africana. It's just sort of like, I know the history department, they just want me in the archives all the time. I don't hate archives, but I want to talk about the blues too. So I can do that over here. Yeah, I mean, it becomes a set of running away from methodological commitments in other departments, and you want to do something more broad, but always about Black people. That's what makes it Black Studies. Although increasingly people will say it makes it Black study, right? It takes it out of the idea of the institutionalized space and into just the world of ideas. Are we talking about just the ideas about Black people or the institutional space that is constantly having to fight for survival on most campuses? So today, I just this week, I'm part of a group interviewing folks for our grad program. And I was surprised. This is the first time I've been on this committee since I've been at Brown. So it's the fourth time. And this was the first time the majority of people who we interviewed actually wanted to ask us when you reach that part of the interview process where you say, do you have questions for us? Mm-hmm. Of the 10 people we interviewed, 7 did have questions for us. And the questions were all about, what are you doing in the community? What are you doing to organize? How does Black Studies see itself as part of a larger freedom struggle? What's happening here beyond the world of ideas? And it took me back, because I could pretty much say, well, there's some individual people who are doing some things, but that is hardly the center of Black Studies now. I mean, my God, I can't even imagine getting half these people to go into the community. I don't think they know where the community is. It's just not part of the center. You know, it's not like how historians have archives. It's not like Black Studies has community engagement. It's just not. But I was surprised at how many of the students, the prospective grad students from all over the country, that was their question. Not the ones from Ivy League schools, I will say. That was not their question. But the others, they want to know. So sort of, what are you doing? And so I actually asked one, we were kind of done, one of the folks we were interviewing at the end, I was like, I'm just really struck by your interest. I and a couple other people in the department always have tight relationships with folks in the. I mean, we can speak about what we're doing, but that's what we're doing individually because of our commitment. It's not necessarily what the department is doing, but we got things that we can pull out and say, that we're doing. And I asked but why are you? I'm surprised to hear that because it really seems that working through epistemological questions about humanity and pessimism seem so central to students for a minute that I'm just surprised to hear all this, what's going on in the community. And we say this, but there's a big change against that. That's what's happening with Black Studies some places. But that there's a lot of students who are kind of like, why can't we do both the intellectual and use the intellectual in a communal sense? And I'm like, well, that would be like what, the going back to the beginning. It was literally what the folks in the first 10 years of Black, that was their argument. This is what it needs to do. It's what it needs to be. And I could go on at some time about how the change. I don't think people care that much to be in the weeds like that. But I find it interesting that we had a group of students just this year. I don't know if it's the changing politics. I don't know what led them all to be like, if we are at Brown University in Black Studies and we have choices between schools that want us, who's at least making it possible for our work with communities of folks to be a part of the program is going to matter. And so I think that Black Studies can be anything it wants to be to anyone. I'm not sure that its original mission is necessarily served by that. Yeah. But that is only a concern to a few folks who think that the original mission was supposed to serve something, So, well, I mean, I'm being very long-winded here.
You've gotten to the heart of. It's interesting for me. I think by the time this comes out, you'll be the 91st, 92nd of these podcasts. But we talk about that tension of the origin of Black Studies, and part of the question, that as I phrase it, is for us to think about it as a tension in the present. But part of what you were speaking to, and I think it's really true and really important to reckon with, is the way the intellectual tradition itself has become so partial. Mm-hmm. Right? Is there a commitment to the intellectual tradition, and then that other question of what is the relationship between intellectual work and liberation struggle? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if both of those things have faded, what does it mean to call something Black Studies? Everything changes over time. Right. But I do think there's this interesting question about, because I think origin stories do matter. Maybe this is just a political sort of ethical question or, claim, but to be disputed. But to give up both of those, or even one of those, strikes me as a wild adventure for us to be on. But I think you're right. I think that's something that's happened in institutionalization. And when you said that about how people come from other disciplines saying, I can't do what I want to do in my disciplinary department, so I'm coming to Africana. That was, you're saying I'm being long-winded. I was like, don't make me long-winded, because that's both an amazing thing and can be a really frustrating thing, because it may shift the meaning of the field.
I think, though, that shift is really captured in the ways that you have a lot of Black younger scholars referring to Black study. Right? That comes from Fred Moten, as you know. Josh Myers kind of popularized it, or not popularized, he's reinterpreted it here recently in his work. But it's an attempt to unmoor, and I think a useful attempt to kind of unmoor the institutional history and understanding of Black studies from the intellectual. Right? And people were just like, I want to follow the intellectual path. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it in the institutional organization of something called Black Studies that remains under attack, that remains unstable, generally, most places, and that is struggling mightily to attract students. For a whole bunch of reasons that the original Black Studies thinkers would explain, would be completely unsurprised at what we're looking at.
That's for sure.
But today, people are like, well, I don't know. Black students just don't like it. Or, they're all diasporic and Black Studies is all African American. I don't know where you've been in the last 20 years. But that's just not happening. So anyway, I think that it's a moment where Black Studies means everything and nothing. Can mean anything to anyone, or it can absolutely mean that you're basically in history or English or psychology and have no interaction with any other Black students, Black people, and you're still Black Studies in this new conceptualization where as long as you're studying Black people, you're a part of Black Studies.
I think your example of Richard Wright or Robert Hayden, I mean, these are really, for me, moments. Like I said, you're breaking my heart, not because you're announcing this to me, but because you're bringing up all of my feelings. About I mean, that is really, there's something really to contemplate there. I don't have an answer, but it's maybe a whole separate conversation. But I understand that canons get revised and people get revised in and out. That's part of what traditions do. But there just becomes, you mentioned Wright, so I'm mentioning it. And, then I'll advertise I have a couple of things coming out on Richard Wright because I'm like, hey, if we're going to talk about
Bring him back.
If people are going to talk about Afro-pessimism and debates around it, maybe Wright and Ellison, their disputes would be.
Look, the Wright, Ellison, Baldwin triad, my God. That'll, first of all, if you're into reality TV, that comes out. Look, just the reality TV aspect of it, right? All the tea, petty, gossipy part of these folks is one thing.
The World in the Jug is like academic jury.
Yes.
I absolutely love that piece. And the students are always like, why are you laughing? And I'm like, are you serious? He's just like, Richard's so sophisticated, he loves wine.
Yeah. Right? I mean, right. And who's the one? Oh my God. What is it? Chester Himes. Is it Chester Himes that writes about the relationship between Baldwin and Richard Wright in Paris in that moment where they're falling out? I'm completely forgetting, but it turns into complete. Well, he's a pauper, and this one is, and this one begs all the time. Yeah. Well, it's just this total kind of, like you're saying, this little shale. He likes wine, all this. Anyway, it's not. My students, when I bring up people, like say in a Black feminist tradition, I can be unpleasant about the fact that people are like, somebody like Anne Ducille, who, because of the beauty of her writing, and of course the quality of her mind, but the beauty of her writing is something I think that you need to sit with, especially with all these folks who are coming in. We have the grad students who come in and they basically want to be public intellectuals. Like, I want to go to grad school because I want a platform, because I want to be on MSNBC. Like, literally, people will write. Or they did about 5 years ago. You saw it much more. I don't see it as much today. But if you want to write, then you need to understand the beauty of writing. Right. And there's for me a handful of folks who I think have sort of mastered the essay form, which is, for, again, my training ground for how to be a writer. It's almost like fiction writers will tell you about the short story. If you can, or poets will tell you about the poem. It's a utility of words. It is, what you're stripping down to is feeling, or the short story. For me, it's the essay more than a book. And if I try to give that to people just to see what their minds are, what they're gesturing toward, I take these people are like, this is not sophisticated. It's probably anti-Black, probably anti-women. It's this. It's like we cannot get to any of the things that I think would be helpful because there's a critique of what they're not doing. And so where they end up with is Hortense Spillers and Saidiya Hart. I mean, it's like 3 or 4 people Sylvia Winter. They're like, these people, if you want to do, some folks that are not just contemporary, these folks, you can go back as far as Hortense Spillers, and that's okay. She got something to say, or Sylvia Winter, go back there. But there's not a lot that's useful, as they tell me, as they talk about it to them in this moment. Beyond that, for Black women thinkers, like I'm specifically sort of marking a Black women trajectory of Black women studies. So it's again things shift and change. I sure do hate though that we are training graduate students who don't know anything about the history of the development of the thinkers who were who choose not to do much of a deep dive in that area. It's not useful for them anymore. It was for me. It was, I can say, you can do it, get in where you fit in. You can do this thing all kinds of ways. I still believe in the value of building your ideas off of sort of what came before, of knowing who has talked about this before. In what kind of ways? What can I learn from it? That's I still believe that's an old school way to think about grad training.
Is that old? I guess that is old school. I was going to say I think that, and I'm like, yeah, I'm old too.
I don't know.
Bring back critical tradition. I mean,
I know.
I love that. Like everybody needs to pause right here and go to their local bookstore and order everything from early 19th century to 1950. And like we were saying. I mean, talk about, like, if you just want some gossipy, juicy stuff, the Hurston Wright letters back and forth. Like, come on now. This is good stuff.
This is good stuff.
If you want drama, there's drama.
We want to call
there,
somebody a sellout. All the ways to call somebody a sellout. My God. Like, you... And then Baldwin, and whatever that piece was where he goes, is it Everybody's Protest novel? Where he goes straight after Richard Wright about making the banker's daughter cry. I mean, come on, that's some world-class shade. Is that what we're going for in protest literature? We want to make Eleanor Roosevelt cry, and he's calling Eleanor Roosevelt the banker's daughter. I mean, my God, I really, just shade. Just shade.
Well, let me ask you about your own work. Yeah, we should have, there should be an edited volume, just people reflecting on really, really good gossipy shade moments.
Yes,
of the Black intellectual tradition.
Do it. You should do the podcast version. People don't read anymore. Let's do the podcast.
Let's do that.
Black Shade. Come on, Black Shade. I feel like we could come up with 10 examples.
This is okay. I have you on the list for this because we are going to start doing some topical, with 2 or 3 guests. Okay. Topical. This is a really good one. It'll probably be the highest listened to. Well, let me ask you about your work a little bit. Your work is, you've talked a decent bit about it. You have social political history, cultural studies at the heart of what you write on. And, it really has, and I speak for everybody on this, has generated really, really important insights and documentation for the field of Black studies.
Oh, my God. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And so I'm really curious to hear you say a word about how you think your work fits in the history of Black studies. Sort of what is it? How is it fitted in that? But also, what new horizons do you see yourself opening up?
So I am still, I think I don't know how much of what I said before is going to survive, but I talked about my relationship to Black studies. You're supposed to be, to me, you're supposed to be providing something that might be a roadmap, might be something that helps people find their way in moments where they feel a little lost, or maybe encourage them to keep going. Because again, I believe that the freedom is a journey. It's the journey. But again, so all of my work it's really stuff that I'm interested in knowing more about. It's questions that I'm trying to unravel that I think might be useful to other folks. So my first with a battle over wanting to write about hair at a time. Now today is like a cottage industry in writing books about Black hair and the politics of Black hair. Oprah did a whole series on OWN or Hulu about the politics of Black hair, but at the time there was nothing. that I was finishing my dissertation, and that became a whole site of struggle around. So, if there's nothing on this topic, is it a topic that should be discussed? Like, right? I mean, somebody surely would have done a book, something like this, if it was worthy. Or where are you going for sources to actually tell a story about how hair mattered to Black people? Where does that come from? And I mean, for me, it came from the Black press, but there wasn't a whole lot of expertise on the Black press at the time on campus. So, but all of that resistance, what it said to me, because I knew for true that there were few women you can talk to that don't have a hair story for you. Something about how hair has impacted their emotional life, their politic, their sense of self, their break from childhood to adult. Like, there's just no women that don't have a hair story. And then for Black women, because you're navigating anti-Blackness, and the ways that things like patriarchy show up in Black communities through hair. What I understood that. I knew that there was a story. So I think I don't think that there's a book that I've done. I'm thinking now. I don't think there's one that doesn't start with me seeing something that I think will elevate and ideas about Black citizenship, complexity, humanity, but also at the same time speak to Black folks who are struggling with something, and just gives me the chance to say, I see you. Like, I see you. And those are important to me. And luckily, I haven't had a whole lot of problems with publishing. It's not like I have people going, no one wants to see that. No one wants to. I really haven't. I can't even say I have. I haven't had a lot of even people after academics. So I think most of my audience, I'm not sure how central academics are to most of my audience. Like, most of the people I hear from may not actually be tenure track academics. They may be other kind of people who are
God
happy.
forbid an academic praise another academic, actually.
Well, there's that too, right? You want to talk about what's wrong with them, and So I think that for me, it's part of being in American Studies, because I was in American Studies at a time when it was very much about telling stories. I was at the University of Iowa, very much about telling stories and doing research on folk culture. It's Iowa. So, which is actually fascinating, because I'm just a nerd. So at some level, I recognize I am just a nerd. There are just random things having nothing to do with my lived experience, my period of time, anything I've ever thought about, that I can go down a deep dive of a rabbit hole and be charmed. I really can. And Iowa helped me with that, because it's like, oh, look at all these folk traditions and the farmers. Let's go see what they're doing. And religious traditions in the Midwest, my God. But also how absent the lived reality of Black people, most places, not the South, or the East Coast are. Mm-hmm. You just, there's almost nothing that you come across in grad student training in terms of a movement. Maybe Chicago pops up from time to time. But for the rest of it, it's just like, yep, there's Chicago, there's New York, DC. Yeah. So in all kinds of ways, I think being in the Midwest, where there wasn't pressure to sound like other people, to be other people in the ways that I find on the East Coast, it's really, I find there's a conformity kind of thing that happens.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I really, it's almost heartbreaking, where people are all trying to sound like everybody else, but just give a little enough of something a little different that you hadn't thought about to legitimate the whole project. But otherwise, you're just really everybody's just saying the same thing. So being in the Midwest, out of the limelight, having all of these idiosyncratic things that I thought of as worthy of scholarly study, Black women's magazines, hair, fashion, like, right, these are not really central to what many departments or disciplines would tell you you need to be spending your time doing. But it allowed me, I think, to have academia make sense in a world of lived reality and community that is that I'm at peace with in how I joined the early conceptions of Black studies that made me, where I was reading Richard Wright and learning all about Patrice Lumumba in the same moment. There's something about the career that I've crafted that I think pays homage to and fidelity to that early understanding I had.
When I'm listening to you to talk just now, it reminded me of the podcast that it came out early January with Walter Grayson, and he talked about, like, one of the things he loves about Black studies is the way with every research project you make your own archive, and the world is an archive, right? And you make out of the world that surrounds your question, you make your archive, and that sense of as you say, I'm interested in telling this story. How do people make sense of lives in this context, or bodies, and politics and culture of movement and all of that. So, no, I love that. That was really fantastic. And this East Coast conformity thing, I cannot tell you, as someone also from out west, just how.
Oh, where are you from?
My family's from Los Angeles. I grew up in Boise, so.
Yeah.
Losing all my regionalisms was a rite of passage. And then I went to grad school in Memphis, so it was
so you
weird
got Southern West, okay.
Yeah, and then being in New England, it's a whole. Some of these things are not like the other. But let me ask a couple questions, sort of, by way of conclusion. The first one being a sort of reflection on the field. And again, I think you've spoken to this, but just to ask it directly, what do you think that the field of Black studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
So I think Black studies has been a rousing success at desegregating traditional disciplines and fields on campuses. This is, to be clear, again, I wrote a book in 20 years ago, 2006, I think, about Black studies. And one of the arguments that I make is that the Ford Foundation, it turned out to be a little bit controversial because at the time everyone was like, no, it was just the Black students who struggled. That was the only thing that led to the founding of Black studies. And I was sort of like, yeah, these foundations were pumping in hundreds of millions of dollars into making these in order to sort of tone down some of the more radical politics. Like, they wrote about it. They wrote to each other about it. It wasn't like I was making things up here. But
if I can interrupt you real quick, I've taught that in my Intro to Black Studies, and the way that deflates the classroom in a productive way is really amazing.
Well, I'm glad you think it's productive, but people are like, no, it's our moment of when the students, they got out there and struggled, and you're all like, some dude named McGeorge Bundy was throwing money at, like, what is that?
I thought it was productive. The students may still be pissed off that I assigned it.
It's
so check in with them.
It gets taught fairly regularly. It has over the years, and sometimes I'll Zoom into classes, and sometimes professors are like, now if things get salty, don't be insulted. And it's always the same salty. You're like the handmaiden for the white supremacist patriarchal culture. You're putting white people in the middle of Black people's business. And by the end, I'm like, yeah, what moment are you clear about that white people haven't been in the middle of Black people's educational business? Like, what is this moment? Anyway, so I had written this book, though, about that was the plan. And on my campus, on other campuses, you can find departments. I don't know about you, Maryland, but you can find departments that go 3 to 4 people deep in something you would call Black studies, like English. They may be doing different periods of time, different what, but you have 3, 4 people over there doing some aspect of it. You could have 2, 3 people in history. 2, 3 over in sociology, whatever. Like, by the time you pull the campus together, there's a healthy number of folks who at one time would have been considered Black studies scholars.
Yeah.
As a part of the Department of Black Studies, and they're not. And that has, again, I'm an institutionalist. I study the institution as well as the intellectual side. That has had a hard impact, I think, on the organization of Black studies. But in the best of times, the things that it's done well is, my God, in 50 years, it has, in many places, completely desegregated knowledge. And I will say it is the field of Black studies, it is those early claims, it's those early thinkers, and it's that consistent push that leads us, and the Ford Foundation, McGeorge Bundy, but it's all of that that leads us to this moment where it is not completely crazy to have more than one Black person in an academic department. Not at all. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has them, but it's not crazy talk. And I think the field of Black studies is owed. That's our debt. We did that. We did that beautifully. And I think that's going to be long lasting. I think that may outlast some of the actual departments.
Yeah.
Because the intellectual basis for continuing them has sort of become, well, it's people who are doing work that can't actually fit in any other department. Let's put them there. Which is different from, this is work that is central to some sort of project that the university is interested in continuing. Again, that may be in the weeds for a lot of people. I just spend time thinking about how we
really
fund
real.
it, but I think it is a rousing success. I think it is a stunning success. I think we celebrate that hard. But the Keeanga Yamada Taylor calls predatory inclusion, the predatory nature of that inclusion means that we're not paying a lot of attention to who the students are on this, or more accurately, I think that the success and valorization of Black studies as a field has made it possible for us, for Black folks in and around Black studies on these campuses, to pay almost no attention to the educational realities of most Black students in this country. And what I mean is, at the same time that you're watching this flowering on campuses, that I think is a flowering that I celebrate, and an explosion of more departments, more PhD programs, more. It's this kind of celebration of Black. I hate this Black excellence because I don't. But there's this celebration of what people often, are kind of like, we're about Black excellence. But the fact that those successes have seemingly blinded most of us to what is happening in schools, in public education, for the majority of Black kids, where illiteracy rates are spiraling, dropout rates are spiraling. Is the not success. I wouldn't say failure, but there's something about that success that's tied to the blindness that most of us, most people I talk to in and around Black studies, I've taken a kind of turn into education. In terms of the work I do, my books, or my work, goes between Black women. I'm going to tell you something about a material history of Black women, material, social, cultural history of Black women, or something about education. And how it's funded and how it's serving Black people. Most of what I do fits in one of those two things. And the success of everything that is Black people in higher education and has really blinded us to what's happening elsewhere. And I'm wondering, what's going to happen to these these fields of study, given the incoming administration that has been fairly broad in its denunciation of something they consider woke, that just seems to be a catch-all for anything that is a critique of Western imperialism and racism. And if no matter what form or version of Black studies there has ever been, it's always that. It's always been that. So what is coming next is what I can't quite see.
And it really goes to that, I like that. I really appreciate you talking about the impact that Black studies has had in terms of transforming disciplines. Mm-hmm. It's not crazy talk to have 2 Black faculty in a history department.
It's really not.
And
we want
that's
more.
An accomplishment.
But there was a time when there was 0 and there was protest against it. They didn't want any.
Yeah. So exactly. Yeah. But I wonder, I'm repeating pretty much what you said, but I wonder about in this far right government moment, what it's going to be like for us in Black Studies to discover who is and who is not, or who are and who are not our comrades. Right. Because I do think you're right. I do think like an investment of like Black Studies has this investment in non-campus everyday Black people and children. I just don't think that's a part of the field.
No.
But also,
not anymore, no.
also, I don't know how many times I've ever looked at another department and said they will refuse to work if they try to shut us down. But I do think psychology would refuse to work if sociology was about to be shut down, right? But who walks off the job for Black Studies?
No, come on. And the
who joins us in the hallway? Who joins us in the quad?
But the lip service that you hear about, we will fight for Black Studies. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I don't. The state of most of the departments, and this is not me shading mine. We have this lovely new building that I am happy to walk in every day, and I understand real estate to be a certain kind of investment. But underneath that, there's some structural deficits that are unique to Black Studies. And again, it's just too much getting in the weeds. But I don't know who would come to our aid. I think I'm co-signing you, beyond the first call of, let's circle the wagons. If it's a slog, if there are multiple moments and occasions, I don't know who would come to our aid. I don't.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys have a fancy new building. Our building's all right. It is, and I've thought about like would I ever write an essay about this, but we are the backside of the building that on the front side facing the main quad is Francis Scott Key Hall, who, his relationship to racism is like all white people of his generation, but especially him, not great.
Well, I mean, that song is, once you know what the song is about, it's on its surface, it's one thing. But
And then the building that we're in is actually just a back build on to that, which is Taliaferro Hall, which Taliaferro, of course, is the T in Booker T. Washington. Mm-hmm. And so I've always thought there's some story to be played out if we're ever defunded about, but they put us in the back to be, servants of Francis Scott Key Hall. But anyway, now you've already gotten me like a year of nightmares into this administration, and we'll see. But
look, I guess we're going to fight back.
This is me at 3 a.m., so every night for like a year.
Well, people are constantly sort of saying, well, our ancestors did more with less, and, blah, blah, blah. And I'm kind of like, there's a whole other institutionalist. There's a whole other kind of undergirding of Black life that has disappeared between our ancestors doing more with less. Like this was before gentrification completely eroded Black communities, historical Black communities. This is before Black churches moved out into counties, et cetera, and became mega churches. It's before it was possible for Black people to rise in the white world quite so high. So they were rising in a Black one, and there were multiple registers in which they saw themselves fighting for Black people. Like, yes, they survived much, much more, but they would never walk across a white campus and refuse to speak to Black people because they're Black. And not acknowledging that change in something, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. And that idea of solidarity, that we're all in this together, I think severely compromises this simplistic belief that just because we survived before, we're meant to survive again. But this is me being pessimistic this moment.
It's a pessimistic
it's a pessimist right there. Low moment. Let's go back to happy. Everybody survives in the end. We all survive.
But that's not just pessimism. That's actually outlining a problem in which we have to, like a geography of a problem, psychological, cultural, political, and physical, that we have to figure out a way to navigate. So I really appreciate you laying it out like that. That's really direct.
But it's made me feel good about my various ramblings today. So I appreciate that.
Shit, it's
If
not
you were rolling
ramblings
your
at all.
eyes,
So
if
believe
you
me.
were rolling your eyes, then you did it silently.
Also, I have my
appreciate
glasses on and I have a terrible prescription, so you couldn't see. But I have not been rolling my eyes. Everybody's going to love this. It's fantastic.
Oh,
So let me ask you as a concluding question. And again, like all these questions, you've spoken, I think, to and around this question. But let me ask it as a way of wrapping up. What is the one issue, thinking in the context of Black Studies, what's the one issue or the one question you'd like us all to be thinking about?
what does freedom look like to you? What does it look like? Do you see it? Do you taste it? Do you feel it? Or do you just think it? What is it to you?
That's a fantastic question. And that is a really hard one, actually. Because I hear these, when people raise these questions as we wrap up, I'm thinking in my head about my own response. That's a tough one, but it should not be. We should have an answer. So I love that you wrap us up with that. That's a fantastic way to conclude this. I really appreciate your time. I was looking forward to this for a long time, and this is just your thoughtfulness and your seriousness of the questions you ask and the world you describe and the way you place this directly in it. It's just been fantastic. This is a great contribution to the series.
Look, your series, I feel special even getting to ask. I feel like I might have been begging all on social media when somebody else was talking about, I just did it. I might have been like, well, someday they may ask me. I mean, probably didn't actually see it. So I am completely honored and thrilled. And I appreciate you and I appreciate the project. And I think the archive that you're creating one day when people want to turn back to Black intellectual production in the 21st century, in the age of Trump, at the decline of Black studies, or is just another day. I think this is going to be invaluable for folks to engage. So I appreciate you. I really do.
Thank you. That's our highest aspiration when we formulated this project. So I like it being seen as that. So thank you. And have a great rest of your day.
All right. You too.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.